Hello, lovely people, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about one of these misconceptions that you see a lot on TV shows and other places, which is this idea that we, autistic people, but probably other neurodivergences as well, are lacking in creativity. I'm Leah Batlle-Rafferty, and this is Memoirs of a Neurodivergent Latina. All right, well, let's just start with the fact that I have a podcast, and I think that's a little bit creative. Okay, we'll move on from there. This particular thing starts when we're very young, I think. It involves things like playing with dolls or other such things where people think that where you don't have the ability to do imaginary play for some reason, just because you happen to not like dolls. So let me tell you my story here. I am the eldest of 30 cousins if I take in both sides of my family, and I'm a Latina, as you know from the title of this podcast, which means that my family is very close. My mom is one of 7. My dad was one of 5. And every single one of those people gifted me like dolls and stuffed animals and everything when I was little, and I was the only child that had been born. Every single one of those dolls, except for the Princess Leia one, ended up on a shelf in my closet when I lived in Central America. And when we moved, we basically sold them all. They were still in their boxes. They were still in their packaging. I never touched them. Why? Why is it that when, all these girls like Barbie dolls and baby dolls and all of these things, I didn't? I think the answer to that lies in a lot of different areas. The first is they are kind of weird. They have these like really tough plastic arms and legs. They kind of move funny. You can't really pose them exactly how you'd like. And so there were all these physical laws to playing with those dolls that actually got in my way when I wanted to imagine something, because the dolls just couldn't do the things that I wanted to do with them. The other thing about them is they're so rigid. Their proportions are so weird. And really, I was never a girl's girl anyways, so I couldn't figure out what the heck I would want to use Barbie for. Like, I don't want to pretend to be in a relationship with Ken, right? And I didn't really want to be a grown-up, so why would I play with a doll that is a grown-up? On the other hand, my internal storytelling, my internal imagination was always wild. I mean, you heard my Halloween episode, which I still don't know if it's imagination, but still, I'm sure some of it is just me coming up with things. I used to write plays and force my cousins when we all went to the beach as the oldest. I must have been a little bit of a pushy bully, maybe. I don't know. It sounded like they enjoyed it, though. But I would write plays, and we would go to the beach as a big, giant family unit with like all my uncles and aunts on my mom's side. And my cousins would perform the plays that I wrote. Or I would do choreography with my sister. In particular, I did choreography this one time that I remember, and I created an entire dance to Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers for one of my cousins, and my sister and I did it, and one of us was Chip and the other one was Dale, and it was just a lot of fun. So I could not play with dolls. Dolls were too rigid. Dolls could not keep up with my imagination. I told stories in my head constantly. I wrote those plays. I liked acting. I loved singing. I used to write songs. I remember when I was maybe 12-ish, I wrote a song. I put it in an envelope. I found, I think, some like publicist address for Kenny Rogers. You got to remember, I'm pretty old. So at the time, there was no like Google or anything like that. You actually had to go to the library, or you had to do a BBS, which is a bulletin board service, which was kind of our way of doing a chat room back when we had modems. Anyways, the point is, somehow I got this address and I created a letter and I asked my mom to send it, and I had a song written in it that I sent to Kenny Rogers. Yeah. And I didn't even really like country, but he seemed someone that everyone admired, so I figured I'd send it. I wrote poetry. I entered poetry contests. I won at least 1 or 2 storytelling, like short story type competitions when I was in high school. So anything to do with words and my imagination was fine. Anything where I had to rely on physical objects to try to pretend, to try to portray my stories, it didn't work because the physical limitations of those objects, I just couldn't work past them. I think it's similar to the expert rule thing. There are rules to how these objects can behave, and because they don't behave in the way I need them to behave, I'm stuck. I can't use them. I think another part of it too, which is super interesting. I'm going to have this friend on an interview. She was telling me that she has really bad visual memory, that she's really good with 2 dimensions, not great with 3 dimensions. And as she's talking, I was like, wow, this is me. This is completely me. I've never met anyone like me who has these issues. I don't have great visual memory. You know, when people talk about imagery and like being able to picture a scene or picture something that happened, I can't do that. In fact, a little bit over a decade ago, a word came out for what I think I have, aphantasia. So this came out, this doctor had a patient who used to be able to picture things in their heads, and then they had some kind of thing happen. I can't remember if it was an accident or something, and afterwards they couldn't, and so they described it to the doctor. And the doctor was like, wow, this is amazing. And, you know, went on to create the term and create a description of the term. But what it is you cannot picture things in your head. My head is kind of like weird colored symbology. I mean, I have abstract feelings of what things are, and I have kind of very abstract views of things, but I could not picture anything, and faces are really hard. And it's not that I can't remember a face or recognize a face, I just can't picture the face in my head. Just like I have a easy time recognizing, you know, where I am in my house, what the house is like, where things are. I know how to get around my work. Like, none of that is affected by this. What's affected by it is that I cannot create this imagery. So what that means is the things that happen in my head are very auditory. So if I'm reading a book, I'm actually hearing a narration. I'm not picturing an image. I'm hearing people's voices. If I memorize a song, that song, I hear it in the singer's voice. So I think that's what leads me to be so verbally inclined and auditory inclined when it comes to things like singing and my stems. Anyways, back to creativity. So, okay, that was until college. When I was in college, I got involved in musical theater. Man, there's so much to tell here. I used to love to sing, and I got put in a lot of theater productions, but then my mother took me to a vocal coach who basically I could only go to 2 sections. We didn't have a lot of money. And so during those 2 sessions, He basically told me everything I did wrong when I sang and gave me no way to fix it. And so from that point on, my confidence in singing went from, oh yeah, this is so much fun, I can get into the play and it'll be great, to, oh shoot, I have to sit here and audition and I suck and I can't sing. And, so that particular 2 sessions led to this shakiness in my confidence in something that I had always been very, very confident in. When I got to college, however, I think it was my second year. I tried auditioning for a few things and I just didn't get it. But I think in my second year, I ended up trying out for the Gilbert and Sullivan Players and got in. And the musical director was a vocal coach from a nearby conservatory. And it was amazing. It was probably one of the best experiences in my life. So from then on in college, I did Gilbert and Sullivan Players, and that was my way of expressing creativity. It was also an interesting way for an introvert to understand how an extrovert feels, because when you're on stage and you are acting and being somebody else and they clap, you get all this energy. You can tell from the energy in the audience how well the night's going to go, and you get really hyped up on it. And I never felt that before. Okay, anyways, so in college, I did that. I took playwriting classes, and I really had a great time with all of those particular things. Then when I left college, I think there was a period of time where I didn't do a lot. Just, hardships of having to start living in the real world. But as I continued, one thing that I became was a total gamer. So when I say total gamer, I mean video games, I mean board games, I mean role-playing games. I even like live action role play. So I loved any form of gaming, and there's a couple of reasons for many of them, but I think for the creativity part, we're going to focus on role-playing games. I love the idea of trying to put myself in somebody else's head and figuring out what they would do in certain situations. I mean, I think my degree in cognitive science shows that that's really one of my huge interests. A lot of what I do at work has a lot to do with that. So role-playing games were always a huge interest of mine. However, just like the laws of physics, just like the expert type rules, if a role-playing game has too many rules, it constrains me. People will say that one particular role-playing game that everyone has heard of, because I think it was the original, allows you a lot of creativity, even though they have so many rules. For me, that particular game is an example of role play, R-O-L-L play, versus role play, R-O-L-E play. So role play, the one with a lot of dice, feels very unimaginative to me. I have so many rules to follow, and I have such a hard time not following rules that it constrains me to the point where I feel like it has a very set pattern of behavior that you can play. There's not a lot of room for creative characters. Or maybe it's the people who run the games that have a tendency to cause it to be so constrained. And if you find someone who knows how to unconstrain it, it would work well. I don't know. All I know is when there are rules, I have to follow rules. So it makes it very difficult for me to tailor this particular game. As I grew older, I found a lot of different companies that did more what they call character-driven gaming. In those cases, the GM the game master or the dungeon master, though dungeon master tends to be very specific, allows a lot of freedom in the characters and adapts the game to let the characters tell part of the story. And that is what I love. That's where I love to be. Those games also tend to be a lot less constrained. And so they allow you a lot more imagination in both creating a character and in running games for characters. And so as I've grown older, I think for the past, I don't even know how long I've been associated with, like the past 10 years maybe. There is a company called Monty Cook Games that creates just the most fun role-playing games I've ever had. They have, and I've spoken to them about talking about this because I was a little, nervous about bringing up a company, but they seemed okay with it. I go to gaming conventions and I run 4 to 5 hour role-playing games for them. I bring in, 6 people around the table, and for 4 hours, I get them to disconnect from their everyday life. I get them to become someone else, and I consider it a huge win if I can get everyone around the table laughing. Even if the story is hard, if players are really, truly enjoying it, I feel like I gave them their money's worth for those 4 or 5 hours where they were sitting around my table, listening to me guide them in the story. So what does this require of me? It requires flexibility. So I can't have a set image of exactly how this game is going to go. If I do that, then every time somebody throws me a curveball, I would become really nervous. So I walk in and I sit down and I know this is going to go off the rails, and I am determined to enjoy the entire event. The moment people start going off the rails, I get to be super creative. I get to come up with ways to try to get them back into the story. I get to modify the story so that they can have fun if they ended up somewhere that we hadn't accounted for. And I can give them a really satisfying conclusion at the end of those 4 hours. So for me, even though I only have, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at a convention, right? And I run maybe 3 games, which is about 12 hours of work. It's not work. It's so fun to make people's day that way. I could talk on and on and on and on about the different games that Monty Cook Games has because they are so cool. One is based on an Eldritch Horror podcast. One is super character driven. Like, I've never seen a game like this one, and it's kind of their boutique game. It's called Invisible Sun. It's amazing. They just have so many cool games, and all of them, in order to create a character, all you need is to write a sentence, and the sentence tells you everything that you're going to set up for your character. It's so cool. Okay, anyways, point is, as an adult, I go to these conventions and I spend the entire time being creative and shaping these worlds for these other people. So maybe I didn't play with dolls. Other ways that I'm creative is I bake. I grew up in a bakery. My mom was a baker. So I've taught myself to make macarons, and I make really cool flavored macarons for Christmas and things like that. So baking, oh my God, you should see the cakes that my children made me make for them. My youngest especially, every year, would come up with a harder cake because he wanted to see if mom could do it. So 4 years ago, right before he went to his college, I made him an oxalotl in a bucket cake. So for those of you who play a certain very popular game with your children, I think you know what this is. But either way, I made an actual axolotl in a bucket where everything was edible, including a chocolate bucket that was silver sprayed and little foam things and water made from homemade jello, like homemade gelatin flavored and colored and everything. And it was awesome. It was like probably the best cake I've ever made. But the point is, there's another way that I'm creative. I'm not arts and craftsy creative. I'm not a cut construction paper and coloring books and play with dolls creative. That doesn't work for me because, once again, everything has rules, and that puts me in a weird situation. Baking, even though everyone calls it chemistry, has rules that are broad rules that, as long as you know the patterns of the rules, you can do interesting things with them. So I play with that. Role-playing games have all of these verbal-based storytelling rules that are just really awesome and are very close to being in a play. Live-action role-play, very, very, very much like being in a play. It's you walk around in a constrained area and you pretend to be someone else, and it's not for everyone, but I had a lot of fun doing it when I did it. So I think what this shows, hopefully what this shows, is that despite our constraints, we can be incredibly creative. And that this particular urban legend or belief is actually really harmful because it prevents people around us, especially when we're children and can't communicate quite as well, from understanding the fact that we may not be creative in the traditional sense of children and how they play, but we are and can be exceedingly creative in different ways. And unless you delve deep into what a child is thinking, you're just not going to be able to find that creativity. And if all you're expecting is for a child to do what every other child does, then you're not going to ask the right questions to understand how is this particular person creative. I want to add one last one because this is creativity, but it's kind of a sideways thing. It's something that eldest, and I find that I sometimes do it too, but it is a trait with eldest. It's that we have different definitions of winning sometimes than other people in games. So it may not be that you are looking to try to beat somebody. It may be that you're trying to get all the gems out of the game sideways, right? So you know you're not going to win by getting all those gems. You're most likely technically going to lose, but you're also going to prevent everyone else from winning. So it's this kind of weird, mischievous sort of self-motivation that is really a creative, different impulse. And it leads to some really, really cool, interesting characters in roleplay, weird board game experiences, etc. Because when you have somebody who's not quite following the what does it mean to win, but still staying within the rules, you end up in this situation where you're just completely like flabbergasted by what just happened. It's kind of fun and it's silly. And it's yet another way to be creative. So hopefully after this episode, everyone listening will understand that we are not fully literal the way that people talk about us. I'm sure some are. Once again, we're a spectrum. But a lot of us aren't. We are very creative. We have interesting hobbies. We think a little bit differently, but sometimes that makes for a really cool situation when it comes to creativity. And as always, those of you out there who are like me, I hope I represented you well, and we are pretty okay. Thank you for tuning in to Memoirs of a Neurodivergent Latina. This podcast was written, edited, and produced by me, Leah Batlle-Rafferty. All music is by Carlos Neda, and this podcast is part of Labrat Solutions, Inc.